right, Leo. So, living in Ohio, but what if somebody lives in another part of the country? But just think of our area for right now. What should somebody have insured for their home? I mean, there's floods in this area. I don't know, are there earthquakes? Is there a possibility of a zombie apocalypse? So, what are some things that people should consider as far as coverage goes?
Well, the zombie apocalypse, I'll let Hollywood figure that one out. But, I tell everybody, well, you got to go with the data. I'm a big data guy as a retired engineer. I can't take that out of my daily life, but I will say, our claims data for the state of Ohio and specifically Northeast Ohio tells us that the two most common property claims we have is wind and water. Do you know what I mean when I say wind and water?
Yeah, probably floods and tornadoes. I don't know.
That's what everybody thinks, actually. That's why I asked you. Actually, floods are dependent upon what's called a floodplain. So depending on how close you are to water, rivers, creeks, lakes, that would qualify you for a floodplain. Now, flood insurance is important. I would absolutely recommend getting flood insurance because that's one of those things that is you never want to have to worry about until you need it. But wind and water, all kinds of wind. So your shingles will blow off, gutters, siding, those will happen. Water coming up through the sewer and drains. Water backup is actually our most common water claim. So that's not just for houses with a basement. That's especially concerning for houses built on a slab. So Sean, when you're showing a house that's built on a slab, that's important to talk to through with your insurance advisor because your drains are at the same height as your kitchen, your living room, your carpet, everything that's finished, drywall, stuff like that. So water and wind, that's your two most common causes of a claim in Northeast Ohio. Now, that's not to say that you specifically have to insure your home for wind because that's already covered in your insurance contract. But water is kind of a la carte. Depending on the water source is depending on how your policy responds. So insurance companies kind of just say wind, tornadoes, cool. That's in your contract. But water, we want to know where it's coming from. So a pipe bursting is automatically covered in your homeowner's policy. The damage caused by a pipe bursting, I would say. I know that sounds like splitting hairs, but that's actually the contract. A flood is not covered. Don't assume you have flood coverage because you don't. If you don't have a flood policy, I don't. If I could underline that in bold on this video verbally, I would. But water backup, that's where we see a lot of claims. Sean, I'm sure you remember a couple of years ago. Do you remember this summer? I think it was like May or June. We had like 5 or 6 inches of water in like 3 hours.
Yeah, I lived in a condo at the time, and knock on wood, my condo was okay, but people across the street lost everything. And it was just like you said, they lived on a flat level, and the water. I was kind of up on a little bit of a hill, just enough, and I got a little bit of water in my garage, but people across the street. As a matter of fact, here we are a couple of years later. I know people that are still getting their work completed as far as getting their, and part of it was their insurance, part of it was contractors doing the work, but what a nightmare.
And that's exactly what I'm talking about. And what people don't talk about is the average cost of a claim. So if you have a finished basement, and this is a statistic that was early 2020, the average cost to repair a finished basement from an average water backup claim starts at $8,000. The average unfinished basement is all going to depend on the kind of stuff you have stored down there. But $8,000 was the average before the pandemic. And that was just the starting. So what used to cost $8,000 to $12,000 is costing substantially more. So when you're saying, what are some things I should really focus on? If you go into your insurance agency's office and you're offered a homeowner's policy that does not have water backup, specifically not at least $10,000, that's the number one thing I would ask for, because that's a very, very statistically likely claim to have happen to you, regardless of where you live, especially if you live in the 44512 zip code, by the way. There's areas of Boardman, and you and I know those areas, that don't have pumping stations and sewage that are robust enough to deal with really heavy water, and they back up all the time. I mean, Sean, we pay a lot of claims in that area. And that's just a good way to protect yourself. That's local knowledge, that's tribal knowledge. So make sure your house is covered for replacement costs. Make sure your liability matches your net worth. Make sure you have a deductible you're comfortable with. Most of us have something valuable, whether it's jewelry, art, fine furs. musical instruments, custom things like that, you should list that on your policy separately. That's a whole discussion you and I can have separately. Water backup, make sure your wind and hail deductible is not super high. A lot of times the trap I see people fall into is sometimes insurance companies offer you a super cheap price and your deductible for wind is 10 grand and they sneak it in there. So read the fine print on your deductible as well. If it's really cheap and you're like, oh man, this is a super cheap policy, it's too good to be true. You can have a competitive price. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with paying a very competitive, fair price, and you shouldn't get gouged for your insurance. It should be reasonable. But if it's too good to be true, probably missing something.